Today, we explore how this date completely reshaped our world across five powerful dimensions: culture, education, finance, politics, and technology. This day proves that history never rests. Let's dive into the fascinating interconnected events of this date that continue to influence how we live, think, and innovate today. So, without much further ado, let's go.
So if you wanted to pinpoint the exact day the modern world was born and, maybe the day it almost completely fell apart,
Mhm.
you really wouldn't look at a specific century or decade or even a specific year. You just have to look at one completely random, unassuming square on the calendar, which is August 9th.
I mean, it sounds kind of absurd on the surface, right? Because
Yeah.
we treat the calendar as this uniform, arbitrary grid to just organize the chaos of time. Like Tuesday the 4th is supposed to hold the exact same weight as Wednesday the 5th.
Right, exactly. Just another day.
Exactly. But when you examine the historical archives, you realize certain dates have this bizarre, almost inexplicable gravitational pull. And August 9th is, I mean, it's the absolute definition of historical density. It's the day the atomic bomb Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. It's the date of these massive ancient naval battles. It is just this focal point for massive systemic shifts in how we actually live.
And for you listening right now, if you want a shortcut to being incredibly well informed, whether for a meeting or just to understand the world, we have curated a custom deep dive into this exact phenomenon. We've pulled together this huge stack of sources. We're talking encyclopedias, historical timelines, reports from economic observatories.
That's a lot of material.
It is. And our mission today is to guide you through five very specific August 9ths that completely reshaped culture, nations, technology, politics, and global finance. So, okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with August 9, 1936, Berlin, Germany.
Yeah, this is a big one.
It really is.
Mhm.
This is the day Jesse Owens basically dismantled a global propaganda machine. So what was actually at stake on that track?
Well, pretty much everything was at stake. You have Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime, right?
Hmm.
And they had meticulously orchestrated the 1936 Olympic Games to be this grand, irrefutable showcase of Aryan supremacy. They literally wanted to use sports as a pseudoscientific proof of their biological superiority.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. And then, you have Jesse Owens, born in Alabama in 1913, right during the height of the Jim Crow era, growing up in just deep, deep poverty. And he arrives in Berlin as this track and field phenomenon. He had already broken multiple world records in a single day at the 1935 Big Ten meet.
Right.
And then on August 9th, 1936, he wins his fourth gold medal, the 4x100 relay. And this was after already winning the 100 meter, the 200 meter, and setting a long jump record of 8.06 meters that, by the way, would stand for 25 years.
Which is just an incredible athletic achievement on its own.
Yeah.
But I mean, the historical weight really comes from the mechanism of how this played out. It's like he was running not just against other athletes on that track, but against the entire weight of a hateful global ideology. Every stride he took was publicly fracturing Hitler's narrative.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is in the mechanism of delivery, because that's what made it so devastating to the regime.
What do you mean?
Well, the 1936 Olympics were among the very first to be heavily broadcast on radio and early television. The Nazi regime intended to broadcast their supremacy directly into living rooms all around the world. But instead, they accidentally broadcast their own defeat.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that backfired spectacularly.
Completely. Owens became this undeniable, highly visible rebuttal to an exclusionary regime. If you read his memoir, which is literally titled My Greatest Olympic Prize, Owens himself states that the physical gold medals weren't even the actual reward.
Right, it was bigger than that.
Exactly. The true prize was the symbolic victory over racial discrimination. He used that global broadcast to become an instant beacon of hope for marginalized communities everywhere.
He proved that human potential has absolutely nothing to do with the hateful boxes society tries to put people in. He forged a completely new destiny for himself and forever altered how the entire world viewed race in sports.
He really took control of his own narrative on a global stage. But You know, the profound historical irony here is that while Jesse Owens used August 9th to break free from barriers and forge his own destiny exactly 29 years later, an entire nation was forced to forge its own destiny entirely against its will.
Yeah, this pivot is crazy. We are jumping to August 9th, 1965. This is the origin story of Singapore. And the visual of this moment in our sources is just striking. You have Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew holding a televised press conference, and he is literally in tears.
Yeah, he was devastated.
He calls it a moment of anguish. He explains that for his entire adult life, he had believed in the merger and the unity of Singapore and Malaysia. But on this exact day, the Malaysian parliament voted to expel Singapore from their federation.
And the vote was 126-0, a completely unanimous expulsion, which the Singaporean MPs actually boycotted. But it made Singapore a sovereign, independent republic literally overnight. They're the only country in the history of the world to gain their independence unwillingly.
Which brings up a really fascinating structural question, like how do you actually build a national identity out of thin air? I mean, they had zero natural resources, a massive unemployment crisis, and citizens who mostly still identified with the foreign countries where they were born.
It requires a ruthless, pragmatic survival strategy. I mean, the leaders of Singapore knew they faced two immediate existential threats: internal division and external vulnerability. To build a unified identity, they couldn't just rely on centuries of shared history, right? Because they didn't have it.
Right.
So they had to engineer it from scratch. Mechanically, they did this through daily rituals. They implemented mandatory flag raising and lowering ceremonies in schools. And then in 1966, they introduced the National Pledge to explicitly emphasize unity regardless of race, language, or religion.
So they essentially had to ritualize a new national identity just to keep the country from fracturing.
Exactly. And economically, they had to pivot just as fast. Without natural resources, they turned to human capital. They established English as the primary medium of education.
Okay, why English specifically?
Because it wasn't just a cultural choice, it was an economic mechanism. It ensured their workforce could seamlessly plug into the global economy. They aggressively courted international capital, successfully luring massive oil companies like Shell and Esso to build refineries right on the island. By the 1970s, they became the third largest oil refining center in the world.
So wait, they became a global oil refining hub without actually having a single drop of their own oil?
Yep. They figured out how to add immense value through location and human skill alone. It's brilliant.
That is wild. But what about defending all of this?
Well, defense required a similarly creative mechanism. They looked around at their larger neighbors and realized their extreme vulnerability. So they consulted Israel, another small surrounded nation, to model a defense strategy. The result was a mandatory 2.5-year national service program for all 18-year-old males.
So just drafting everyone.
Right, but this wasn't just about building an army. It was an integration mechanism. You take a Chinese-speaking kid, a Malay-speaking kid, and a Tamil-speaking kid, put them in a muddy trench together, and force them to rely on each other to survive.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that deeply cemented a shared national identity way faster than any government speech ever could.
They basically took their greatest vulnerability, being isolated and unwanted, and transformed it into this engine for incredible political stability and economic growth, which, honestly, makes the next stop on our calendar so jarring.
Oh, the contrast is huge.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because just as Singapore was successfully cementing political stability and public trust in the 1960s and 70s, exactly 9 years after Singapore's independence, the United States experienced a catastrophic collapse of political trust.
August 9th, 1974. The day Richard Nixon became the first and still the only U.S. president to ever resign from office. His resignation became effective at noon. He said his farewells in the East Room and departed the White House lawn on the Army One helicopter.
And, the history books often just list the events leading up to this, the Watergate break-in, the smoking gun tape, the Saturday Night Massacre, but the actual mechanisms of how this corruption infected the government are just staggering.
Mm-hmm.
How did a botched hotel break-in systematically dismantle the presidency?
It really came down to a fundamental abuse of power and the dismantling of government guardrails. The smoking gun tape, for instance, wasn't just evidence of a lie. It was literal audio proof that Nixon actively ordered the CIA to block the FBI's investigation into the break-in.
He weaponized them against each other.
Exactly. He weaponized one intelligence agency against another just for his own personal political survival. And then the Saturday Night Massacre is just this masterclass in how institutional trust is broken.
Break that down for us.
So Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire the independent special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, because Cox was investigating him. Richardson refused and resigned in protest. So then Nixon ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to do it. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Yeah, Nixon just kept going down the chain of command until Solicitor General Robert Bork finally carried out the firing.
So it wasn't just a single controversial decision. It was the systemic, deliberate dismantling of the Justice Department's chain of command until he found someone willing to execute an unethical order.
And that systemic rot was sprawling. I mean, in total, 69 people were charged in the Watergate scandal, including 2 sitting cabinet members. The scale of the corruption was entirely unprecedented in modern American history.
Now, to be completely objective about the history here, as outlined in our sources, the constitutional mechanism of succession actually did hold. Vice President Gerald Ford stepped in, taking the oath of office in that exact same East Room, famously declaring our long national nightmare is over, and subsequently granting Nixon a full pardon.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the institutional transition functioned, but the psychological damage to the American public was permanent. I mean, the electoral consequences were immediate. The Republican Party suffered heavy losses in the 1974 midterms, and it arguably cost Gerald Ford the 1976 presidential election.
Yeah, the trust was just gone.
Completely. It fundamentally shattered the implicit trust the American public had in the executive branch. Our sources note there are over 30 memoirs written just about this one scandal alone.
It even changed how we talk. Like, the scandal left a permanent linguistic scar on the global lexicon. We now attach the suffix "gate" to almost any controversy anywhere in the world, just to denote a breach of trust.
Deflategate, Pizzagate, you name it.
Exactly. So by the late 1970s, you have an American public that is deeply cynical and completely disillusioned with traditional government institutions. But where does a society put its hope when it stops trusting politicians? In the 1990s, they transferred that hope into technology. Which brings us to August 9th, 1995.
Ah, the Netscape IPO.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. Try to put yourself in the mindset of 1995. The internet existed, but it was this clunky, text-heavy, totally obscure network, mostly used by academics and the military. It was basically a black screen with green text. But then Netscape had built this browser called Navigator.
And Navigator fundamentally changed the mechanism of the internet. It made the web visual, it added graphics, point-and-click navigation, intuitive design. It basically translated raw code into a magazine-like interface that anyone could use, and they quickly captured like 70% of the market.
So on August 9th, 24-year-old Mark Andreessen, whose personal style at the time was famously described as frat party ready, and his co-founder Jim Clark take Netscape public. They priced the shares at $28.
Which was high at the time.
Very. But the demand was so manic that morning that there was a massive order imbalance on the NASDAQ queue for 2 full hours. They physically couldn't open the stock for trading. When it finally did open, it shot up to $71 a share. There is this mind-blowing comparison from the Wall Street Journal in our sources.
Yeah.
It took the aerospace company General Dynamics 43 years to become a $2.7 billion corporation. It took Netscape about a minute.
And they hadn't even turned a dime of profit yet.
Exactly. Which raises the ultimate question, why? Why did investors throw billions of dollars at a company with zero profits?
Because of the technological promise. I mean, investors realized that the visual web wasn't just a new product, it was an entirely new dimension for human commerce and interaction. Netscape proved that in this new digital frontier, attention equaled future capital. That single IPO kicked off the dot-com boom of the late 90s. It brought the World Wide Web into mainstream popular consciousness and just ignited this wave of euphoric optimism.
But didn't that massive success immediately threaten the established tech giants?
Oh, it terrified them, particularly Microsoft. Netscape's rise sparked a brutal browser war, and Microsoft's mechanism for fighting back was, well, ruthless. They owned the Windows operating system, which had a virtual monopoly on personal computers. So they decided to just bundle their own browser, Internet Explorer, directly into Windows for free.
Oh, wow. So you couldn't avoid it.
Right. You literally couldn't buy a PC without it. This made purchasing Netscape completely redundant for the average user. It was a predatory strategy that was later legally ruled as an anti-competitive, illegal restraint of trade. But, the damage was already done. Netscape was steadily starved of market share and eventually forced into a sale to AOL.
So they birthed the digital age, but became one of its first major casualties.
Yeah, pretty much.
And the broader legacy here is that the euphoric, irrational risk-taking that began with the dot-com boom didn't just stay in Silicon Valley. Over the next decade, that mentality mutated. It infected the broader global financial system. Which brings us to our final August 9th. Exactly 12 years to the day after the Netscape IPO, the modern financial system snapped.
August 9th, 2007. Adam Applegarth, who was the CEO of the UK bank Northern Rock, described it as the day the world changed.
The headline event of this day is that the French bank BNP Paribas abruptly halted activity in 3 of their major investment funds. They basically told investors they couldn't value the assets in those funds because the subprime mortgages they were holding had become completely illiquid. Nobody would buy them. And instantly, global credit markets just froze.
Yeah, and to understand the sheer panic of this moment, we really have to define those terms. Subprime mortgages were home loans given to borrowers with poor credit histories, people who were statistically highly unlikely to be able to pay them back.
Right, high-risk loans.
Exactly. And these risky loans had been packaged together and sold as supposedly safe investments. So when BNP Paribas said these assets were illiquid, it meant that the wider market had finally realized these packages were full of toxic, worthless loans, and absolutely no one was willing to buy them at any price. The money was trapped.
And the mechanism of how this froze the global economy is fascinating because it comes down to how banks were actually funding themselves on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Up until that day in 2007, banks weren't just taking customer deposits and locking them in a vault. They were heavily relying on what's called the interbank wholesale market.
How does that work?
To put it simply, imagine a restaurant that, instead of buying its own ingredients in bulk, relies on borrowing flour and sugar from the restaurant next door every single morning just to bake its bread.
Okay, I follow.
It works perfectly fine as long as everyone trusts each other. But if the neighbor suddenly suspects you can't pay them back, they lock their doors. The first restaurant can't serve food, and the business immediately collapses. That is exactly what banks were doing with cash. They were borrowing billions from each other on a daily basis to fund their lending.
So when BNP Paribas froze those funds, it sent a signal that toxic subprime risk was hiding everywhere, and no one knew which bank was holding the bag. The trust completely evaporated. The neighbor locked the door, and the daily funding model came to a juddering halt.
And that triggers a massive chain reaction. We see a literal bank run on Northern Rock in the UK. People queuing in the streets to pull their physical cash out, which hadn't happened in Britain for 150 years. This event on August 9th was the first major domino falling that ultimately cascaded into the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in 2008 and the Great Recession.
Now, I want to push back on the standard cultural narrative here for a second. We usually point the finger exclusively at greedy Wall Street bankers originating risky mortgages. And obviously that happened. But according to our economics observatory sources, didn't governments play a massive role in creating this environment too? I want to make sure we are looking at this impartially.
This raises an important question, and honestly, the sources validate your point completely. The ultimate cause was deeply systemic and heavily driven by public policy. Governments on both the political left and the right, in countries like the US and the UK, utilized housing policies to aggressively push home ownership for low-income families. Expanding the American dream of owning a home was seen as an absolute social good.
So it sounds like the government built this massive high-speed highway to home ownership. But simultaneously, Wall Street removed all the speed limits and the seatbelts.
That's a highly accurate way to look at it. Governments were actively deregulating the financial sector while simultaneously encouraging banks to aggressively lend to those exact same low-income households, largely ignoring their actual ability to repay the loans over the long term. It wasn't just a failure of private finance, it was a catastrophic systemic failure where public policy directly incentivized and fueled unsustainable financial practices.
And the resulting fallout required massive taxpayer bailouts and plunged the world into a sovereign debt crisis.
Yes.
So bringing this all back to you, the listener, whether you are prepping for a meeting, trying to understand how our modern institutions got so incredibly complicated, or you're just a deeply curious person, looking at this one single day, August 9th, gives you an absolute masterclass in human history. We've seen the power of individual defiance against fascism with Jesse Owens in 1936. We've watched the painful forced national birth of Singapore in 1965. We explored the mechanical collapse of political trust with Nixon in 1974, the euphoric technological explosion that Netscape sparked in 1995, and the devastating freeze of global finance in 2007.
It is a staggering amount of history to be anchored to one square on a calendar. But I want to leave you with one final unmentioned nugget from our historical archives to mull over today. Let's go all the way back to August 9th, 1892. On this exact day, Thomas Edison received a patent for the two-way telegraph.
Wait, really?
Yeah, think about the underlying poetry in that. August 9th is the day that gave us the two-way telegraph, a massive breakthrough in bridging distances. It's the exact same date that, 103 years later, gave us the Netscape IPO, unleashing a tool meant to instantly connect the entire globe. And yet, it is the exact same date that Singapore was completely cut off, expelled, and isolated from its closest neighbor. True connection and total disconnection, all bound to the exact same unassuming square on the calendar.
That is incredible. It really proves that the calendar isn't just a grid of numbers to organize our week. It is a map of how human beings break apart and how we relentlessly pull ourselves back together. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Hi viewers, family and friends. How did you like the content of this video? Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Please write in the comments your name and the place you are watching from. Since our viewing family is spread all over the world, it will be nice to know which city and the country you are watching from, so I can say hello to you. Science and technology. Reading and listening to the historical accomplishments on this date of those who have gone before us, I, as a professional engineer with interest in structural engineering, energy-efficient buildings, ICF construction, and as Google Docs expert with interest in spreadsheet-based solutions, draw inspiration to ask of myself the million-dollar question. What would I accomplish today? Think about the Japanese practice of Kaizen. Let me know in the comments, what would you accomplish today? Your subscribing to the channel inspires me to post more such videos. Thanks for your patronage. See you in the next video. Sincerely, Yogi Anand.